Good evening, everyone. Hi. Sorry, very loud. Welcome to Modern Art Oxford. My name's Ciara Maloney, and I'm the curator of exhibitions and projects here. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's event, a conversation between Barbara Kruger and Iwona Blazwick. We're opening an exhibition by Barbara upstairs tonight, which I hope you'll get a chance to see after the talk. So, to introduce Barbara, Barbara's had a career spanning over 4 decades. And she's a hugely famous artist. Many of you are familiar with her work already. She's one of the most significant artists working today. She works across a wide range of media, including site-specific installation, single and multi-channel film, and collage works, all of which you can see examples of upstairs. Barbara has consistently investigated the visual strategies of mass media and the messaging which it disseminates in culture today. So I'm very pleased to be here with Barbara this evening. Barbara will be joined by Iwona Blazwick. Iwona is the director of the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London. And prior to that, she worked as the head of exhibitions at Tate Modern, and before that at the ICA, which is where Barbara and Iwona first met back in 1981. So there's a long friendship stretched over many years, and hopefully we'll hear lots of nice stories this evening. Just a few housekeeping notes tonight. If you could all please make sure to turn off your mobile phones. And please, no photography this evening. And yeah, afterwards we'll have some time for questions, so think of some good ones. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a great point of excitement, really, to see a new installation by Barbara Kruger. Barbara, the influence of your work has percolated, I would say, through art, through activism, through criticism, through pedagogy, and actually through advertising. There are lots of Kruger tributes on the dark side. Can you say something about who was influential for you, particularly in your early career?
Well, first, let me begin by saying, and I have said this before, and I don't want it to seem like I'm gigging, but it's really true. Every time I hear that I've been making work for decades and decades, it feels like 20 minutes on a certain level. And it feels like 20 minutes ago that you and I met, even though it's like 30 years ago. But I have to say that for me, I still can't believe that people know my name and know my work. I know they do now, but it's sort of how it happened is so arbitrary and strange, and the sort of confluence of fortuitous social relations, historical circumstances, hard work, a degree of luck. But again, there's this arbitrariness that makes up the anthropology that is the art subculture. And to me, it is an anthropology, and I'm lucky to be in it. So as far as influence goes, because I went to university for a year and art school for a year, I never really thought I'd be an artist in the real art world. I thought, well, I could draw, and maybe I'll be a fashion illustrator or something like that. And then I started working as magazines, as a designer. So I had no real art figures, per se. I think that as I got a little more acclimated into, when I came to New York, being a little more aware of cinema and some art, and my colleagues, my peer group were other young artists, I began to understand that people were of influence. And I think, when I think back, the early films of Sam Fuller, for instance, those great black and white films that were very expository in their speech and their text, and sometimes just so full of shit, which made them so great on a certain level. And I think after that, the early work of Chantal Akerman, especially Jean Dielman, when I saw that when I was in Berkeley, and she had come to the Pacific Film Archives and showed that film, which was an amazing sort of look at everydayness and real-timeness in a woman's life. And, of course, the work of Yvonne Rainer. I remember seeing the beginning performances of This is a Story of a Woman Who, and when she danced with the Grand Union. And a bit later, when I started writing, I will say the early work of Patti Smith, who introduced me at one of my first poetry readings. I'd say, yeah.
We first started working together in the 1980s. On a show actually in 1983 at the ICA. And for me, I don't know if you'd agree, it was an amazing time because there was this kind of upsurge of new voices, new critical voices, people like, I was reading Rosetta Brooks and Craig Owens and Hal Foster. And it was also a time when people were talking about these ideas like desire. They were talking about the influence of psychoanalysis, of anthropology, of these other discourses outside of art history and outside of the art world. Mass culture, media studies, all of these things were buzzing around. And there was also a sense of a kind of second wave feminism, where very young artists at the time, like Jenny Holzer, Cindy Sherman, Laurie Simmons, Judith Barry, and exhibitions like The Revolutionary Power of Women's Laughter were deploying a kind of politics of pleasure, a way of seducing the viewer through pictures, and the word pictures was being bandied around a lot, and narrative. Could you say something about that wider context when your work started becoming known and shown?
Yeah. Again, in terms of feminisms, always a plural for me, I wasn't aware at that time of first wave, second wave, third wave. I totally was sort of hadn't really been familiar with the rhetoric or the polemic about the history at that time. But I did know that in our smaller, much smaller art subculture at that time, I mean, when I first came on the scene and was working at magazines, the art world in New York felt like 12 white guys, you know, and am I nostalgic for that? No. You know, these are the good old days. I've said this before, not because they're good, but because we're alive to experience them and change them. But I think what happened at that time was that because artists are always a reflection in some way of their culture, I grew up watching TV and going to movies, and my peer group in New York, who I got to know, many of whom were one of the first graduating classes from Cal Arts, because I didn't graduate from college, and a few other stragglers, who we were, we just sort of thought it was natural to make art which was about the media that we were looking at. And a lot of us were women. I always say Jenny and myself and Cindy and Richard Prince. You know, and there was a sort of understanding of what we were dealing with, and the issue of representation, which is a word which is never used anymore very much, and how pictures and words had power, and how the stereotype was something which could be, you know, parlayed and played with and resisted. And again, through the writings of Craig and Hal and Kate Linker, and this was part of a dialogue happening.
I also got the feeling that as women had been excluded from the so-called fine art canon, they were drawn to those mediums that were also excluded, that were at the margins, like photography at that time. And in fact, it is the case that the Tate in Britain didn't start collecting photography as art until about a decade ago. Yeah. So it's all very, very recent. And I think it was an exciting time when women in particular were looking at these forms like photography, moving image work, and so forth, which had not been accepted and certainly weren't part of the kind of museum acquisitions that were dominating both the market and public platforms of art at the time. In fact, I have with me here a book I treasure, which is from 1978, and it's called, as you can see, Picture Readings. And you published this as it's a series of stills or photographs of architectural details alongside, I would say, short stories. They're almost sort of Raymond Carver-esque, I would say. Can you tell us something about this very early juxtaposition of image and text?
Yeah, architecture was my first love. It's sort of the sort of discipline that I was most drawn to as a young girl, and always drew buildings and planned developments. And of course, we never had money to buy a house, so it was just totally from this little 3-room apartment in Newark, New Jersey. I was like drawing these structures, these residential developments and stuff. And I really don't take photographs very much now at all, really, very seldom. But I went around to California and Florida and would take pictures of these structures and coupled them with these quasi-narrative stories, which are very close readings of a physical space and the people that embody them. And it was part of a group. I had self-published 3 books. One was called TV Guides, which a number of artists had written in, and the other was No Progress and Pleasure. And then there was this one.
So what happened? You stopped taking photographs and started appropriating found photographs, and then the text becomes fused with the image. And you'll see upstairs there's a wonderful group of works from the 1980s, which are really the beginning of that. So what happened? Why did you decide to pare that language down and then fuse it with the image?
10 years at Condé Nast.
Aha.
That's where I learned that visual skill, is that in many ways my job as a magazine designer, I never worked in advertising, sort of morphed into my work as an artist with big differences on the level of meaning. But what I did at Condé Nast, at Mademoiselle, which was a women's magazine. There were 2 young women's magazines there, Mademoiselle and Glamour. And Glamour was for the young professional, and Mademoiselle was for the college girl. So Sylvia Plath had been a guest editor, Gloria Steinem as a young girl. So I was at Mademoiselle, and I felt like, I was like a Martian there. Anyone in the art department was like a Martian at these magazines, So basically I started out doing page design, back a book, and then I was promoted to, the designer. I was never an art director. And I took other people's photographs, some very prominent photographers too, and I would paste over them just dummy type that said ABCD because they hadn't written the titles yet. Or I would read a story. And so that's where I really learned that fluency, was working at magazines.
Exhibit B.
Oh, yes.
So this is our catalogue together. And as you can see, very key characteristics. First of all, the source of the images nearly always seemed, in this period of your work anyway, to be drawn from another era, from the 40s and 50s. What attracted you to that period?
Some of them were actually later, but because I didn't have the money to print them in color, nobody else was paying for this work, by the way, is when they were converted to black and white. They were, they just looked older, but some of them were older, but some of them not. And I had accumulated what is now called an archive. But believe me, it was not an archive in my mind. I was just, collecting these pictures. And even now, for instance, these paste-ups upstairs, I have them, and they were how I put my images together before I started working on a computer. And people, when I first showed them, they said, "Oh my God, your archive must be incredible. They're in such good shape." Piles of them in plastic envelopes. Really, I think what most artists understand is that we have a much less fetishistic relationship to the products of culture than the accompanying managerial and curatorial section has to. Not that they want to either necessarily, but just the way it works,
It's interesting looking at this. Also, do you feel that because it looks from another time, that it gives us a sort of distance to the image. It gives us an opportunity to stand outside of it and see it in a different and maybe aesthetic way.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it depends who we are. Mm-hmm. You know, there's some people who, it's so interesting because some people feel approached by the image in one way very different than others. Sometimes that's delineated by gender, sometimes not. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people feel closer to it, sometimes people feel alienated by it and able to objectify it in a different way. But it really does, I think, change from viewer to viewer. I think that's true of every work, you know,
of course.
Even if it's performative, you know.
And starting with expediency, no money, you used black and white, but then you actually continued until quite recently to have these very monochromatic works where there'd just be one colour. Initially always red, and it would be a frame, and then with your lenticular works we start seeing turquoise, pink, and now this fabulous green. Mm-hmm. So why did you continue that pared down monochromatic?
Well, I'll tell you, in 1988, I started making larger works on vinyl. Mm-hmm. And at that time, they were silk screened. And that was a huge economic, it was very expensive to do silkscreen works. And I remember, to do a black and white one work cost $8,000. A silkscreen work, large on vinyl. To do a color one cost $14,000. I mean, huge discrepancy. And then, and this really has to do with the material procedures of production. Soon afterwards, they were made at the largest silkscreen bed in North America outside of Toronto. And what happened was the American government ruled that there could be no more tobacco or alcohol billboards. So that place closed down.
Oh, I see.
And then what happened was that digital production started coming in. And I stopped making large vinyl works for years because the level of resolution was so low and so horrible. About 5 or 6 years later, digital started catching up, and color cost the same amount of money as black and white. Mm-hmm. And it changed my production, also was so much cheaper to make. Mm-hmm. So everything was so brought in by what the material conditions were, of course, you know.
And yet there's a tremendous power to this, I think, that pared downness,
yeah.
And it actually gave it such visual impact. I mean, it really hit the back of your retina. It was really part of its kind of almost phenomenological presence. I remember we were trying to get one of these huge red-framed works into the gallery, into a sort of Regency building on the Mall. Right. And you could see people on the road actually stopping and looking at this massive thing going in through the window. So I think it has made something which is so visually arresting. That expediency led to a very powerful strategy.
But also questions of scale. I should say, you know, Iwona was the first curator to ever invite me to do a show at a museum. And this was a huge moment for me. It was so important. And I do believe that at that time, some of those works, the really large ones, were done in 3 pieces, because there wasn't paper that big to make in one piece. But I remember hanging those large works in the space, and the ICA was, to me, the hippest, scariest place in the world. It was just the amount of discourse, of public programming, of curatorial adventuresomeness was so riveting that it was truly unforgettable for me, you know. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've talked about images, and I wanted to move on to language. And at the risk of sounding a bit pretentious, I have a quote from Wittgenstein. But anyway, listen to this. It's so good, this. He said, "Sometimes an expression has to be withdrawn from language and sent for cleaning. Then it can be put back into circulation." And I sort of feel that what you do is you take from vernacular and from a kind of a common language, as it were, and you send it to the cleaners. And you also destabilize language in that you think you're going to read an aphorism, but then something happens, something gets twisted. You've talked about the importance of the pronoun for you. Can you say something about how you approach language?
Well, it really cuts through the grease to use a pronoun. You know, you're literally reaching out and touching someone on a certain level. So I felt it was a very economic way to address a viewer or a reader or a looker. And yeah, I mean, it's very useful for the text. I should say that, again, one of the things that always bedeviled me was when people would just say that my work was slogans. Oh, it's slogans, more of Kruger's slogans. You know, what does the text say? You know, it's so easy to get involved in a kind of reductivist judgment without actually taking into consideration what those texts are. And in the video upstairs, you'll see where I've written scripts that actually, when something is time-based, you have to spend a bit more time with it, which was different for me because I have a very short attention span. And, you know, which is one of the reasons why the texts were so relatively short, also owing to magazines, but also I feel very connected to digital culture in that way, that, you know, it's sort of shredded into a million sentences. You know.
But also, isn't there a sort of political dimension to that? That they are so fast to grab you, to address you, and you feel implicated. I mean, I think they work on obviously many levels, and in fact there is a text, which I haven't read yet, in this catalogue by someone called Timothy Williamson. Is he here by any chance?
No.
But he's a professor of logic, and it's very, very interesting to see a deconstruction of this language and how, beyond its apparent simplicity, how profoundly complex it is and the sort of discourses that it triggers. So
yeah, I was so happy that Timothy Williamson accepted, you know, writing about my work. And we met him the other day. Kira and I were very nervous about meeting him, and he was just a lovely man. And the consideration that he gave for the words and the close reading he did was so meaningful to me in so many ways. So I was very happy about that.
We talked earlier about the kind of manifesto-like aesthetic of what you've done. And actually you said that's got nothing to do with European avant-garde, which is what I'd thought, that there was a relationship. But it is true that you've used text not only to communicate with words, but also the positioning of the text, particularly in those works you'll see upstairs, is also against language. So quite often they'll be across a mouth or they'll blind a face. So there seems to be perhaps this sort of meta-critique of language as power or as something which can stop understanding as well as promote it. Could you say something more about that?
Mm-hmm. I think it might exist in the work. There are also a lot of hands in the work, too. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's true, and yet, the importance of language is just so pivotal and is in crisis in many ways. Our ability, again, I'm not nostalgic, but our ability to focus and pay attention, to me, narrative is over in so many levels. Books are in crisis. The ability, I think people read and watch episodically now rather than narratively. So language is still existing, but the economies are changing. So I think, and the way people write, who ever thought that haiku would be the predominant form of the 21st century? You know, it's sort of.
And you kind of extrapolate that with the film 12, because we're hearing a narrative, and then we're seeing underneath almost like a news flash or a kind of Bloomberg stocks and shares readout, what they're thinking. Mm-hmm. But the thoughts themselves of the characters in the film upstairs fall into patterns of very reductive cliches or very reductive emotional states or observations, which are mostly centered around anger. Or they seem to have a sense of frustration or misunderstanding.
I think misunderstanding might be closer to it. Or an inability, or not listening. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, just basically speaking and not listening on a certain level, maybe.
Do you think that's a sort of American thing, the emphasis on the oral, on the you know, there is this sort of evangelical tradition particularly in American politics. And I know that in American schools, children are encouraged to give oral presentations, much more so than they are here. Do you think that's you're tapping into that?
I certainly think it has not. If that is the case, it has not resulted in any level of articulateness that I can really read. But certainly an earlier work of mine that had an audio track, I used a sort of evangelical track, which sort of conflated the evangelical with the sports, just the notion of the crowd, and that power, you know.
There's been a lot of commentary and observation about your use of the word you and we. Could you say something about these subjectivities that you're addressing or articulating?
Well, I think that they're shifting. I mean, they're shifters for sure. And again, they do have a degree of address to them. I've always been interested in public address. And because when I did write for Art Forum, I wrote about television and movies, not about art. And much of that TV, if it was news, certainly had public address, certainly had direct address in it. And that is something that the pronouns really facilitate. And it has been a motor of my work, whether it's in these images or whether it's in the video or whether it's in a rap or an installation. We talked before about how language is there, and it's there to immerse the body in a different way than, say, in the smaller pictures, you know.
Well, let's move on to that, because in the 1990s you did step beyond the two-dimensional into full spatial environments. So we've seen things, for example, you were commissioned by MoCA in Los Angeles, then the Temporary Contemporary, as it was called, you did this huge mural. So there's, I think, two elements to this. One is occupying public space, and it could be through a matchbook or an enormous billboard. So your use of scale, I think, is really important. And the fact that you've used all these different ways of distributing your work. And then the immersion in space, these kind of, again, a phenomenological experience of language, which we have par excellence upstairs. Yeah. But that first thing, the idea that your work of art could be on something as humble as a mug or a T-shirt, what inspired you to do that?
Which I've been demonized for in many ways, you know. Gift shop, blah, 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 you know. I basically think that that the images and words have the possibility of traveling well, you know, and they make their meanings where they are. And to me, the everyday is so important. I feel comfortable in the everyday. I hate the event like this. Freaks me out. I like the moments between events. And it's those mugs and those bags and that thing about the everyday, which really I feel people develop an intimacy with objects, you know, certainly more so than they do with human beings sometimes. So I think it's a chance to engage that. And of course, that's where the power of fashion comes from too. So, you know, but I think what's happened, Iwona, when I got some degree of prominence, and again, there's a difference between the figure and the body. I mean, this is the body, and then there's this figure, this other person who, whatever, people will make of it what they will, you know, but that is something different then. But what happens with that is that all of a sudden there came to be people who were willing to support my work and make it possible for me to make work which I could never do on my own financially. And I remember, so that allowed me to spatialize my work, which was a huge change, to take those black and white photographs, or sometimes color, and to really use them to engage architecture, which was my first, you know, real interest. And that became thrilling for me. And I first did my first room wrap, I think in '91, when, again, they were still silk screens and they were wallpaper, and it was amazingly expensive, and nothing was for sale on that show. You know, it was not like I could ever, you know. And then after that, I started, quite a bit after that, I started doing video. And another way of spatializing the work, and which was much more interesting, that you could vary the scale with the space that you were in. And I remember I had initially done some work for MTV, Silence of Violence, so I started working with video, and I started working with sound for installations. And then after that, I started doing text videos, which I first showed in Melbourne with Juliana Engberg, who is here, and then added a visual dimension to that, which was my first large-scale video work, which was slides and videos. And I showed them at Deitch Projects in '97. And that was sort of a huge breakthrough for me to be able to spatialize the work. But again, it was through the support of institutions and museums and spaces that allowed that. I think it's always important to say that, because it's not like an artist burst on the scene with a beret and a pair of scissors and poof, you know? I mean, it really is problematic how you get funded. Now there are other ways. There are artist spaces, or people working together collaboratively to do it, but it's always a challenge, you know?
Exhibit C, this is the two ways of seeing one work. It's a lenticular. Help. I'm locked inside this picture, and then you can see this image here. What I wanted to show that in relation to what we'll see upstairs, because it also demands that we move, because you've got to sort of go like this to see how a lenticular works. And what you'll see upstairs in that big space is an extraordinary installation which demands that we ourselves become almost dancers. We have to move all the way up one way and then down the other to be able to read it. And we're also, it's a kind of 360-degree rotation that we have to do, because it's immersing us, this work, in different texts. So they're on the floor, they're on the walls, they're on the ceiling, and each one of them demands that we physically move in a different way. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that we've now been choreographed by you. So it's not just a sort of conceptual interpretation of the work, it's actually a physical one. Did you plan, how did you plan that, and what's your intention with that?
Well, I like the immersiveness of being able to deal with space. And again, each space has its own problem solving. And this in particular, when I went to look at the space, it was thrilling to me, because the history of the building is so implicit in the structure itself. I love the space. And the team here was so incredible, because it was a difficult installation, dealing with the idiosyncrasies of this kind of building and the irregularities. But it was to deal with the height, to deal with, you know, how text would embody that space, was a challenge, but it's the heart of the work to me. Doing that work, figuring out how the text, and I don't build models, I don't have acolytes and assistants, I have to tell you. Not that it's wrong, but it's not my methodology, it's not my way of working, but I can walk into a space and pretty much know immediately really how I think things will play out. I know on my visit here, I knew the video would be there, and how that space should be a wrap on a certain level, you know.
And the other thing that's interesting in the journey through this major work upstairs is that it ends up kind of being sublime, because there is so much, you're in this cacophony of definitions of types, and of, in a way, imperatives. And then suddenly you see, in gradations of from grey to black, this vast word, joyful. So, and in fact, someone pointed out that these guys over here, you'll see a whole wall of these, that they're like a congregation. And so there's a kind of interesting sense of an audience and of a chorus.
A choir, definitely,
a choir,
yes.
Yeah.
Some of which like singing and some of whom don't.
Yeah. Now, as you said, you wrote actually as a film critic in Art Forum for many years, but you yourself have become a film director, in a way. Could you say something about your experience of creating 12, which is this major film work upstairs?
It was really interesting. The first version, the actual first one I used actors, was called Power, Pleasure, Desire, Disgust, which I showed at Deitch, and I made that at the Wexner Center. One of the great things about the Wexner Center in Ohio is that it actually allows artists to make work there and to shoot film and to do editing, which would have been, I couldn't have afforded to do that at that time, no way. This last film and the one after it, The Globe Shrinks, I shot in Los Angeles. And of course, it's a great place, unfairly so, it's a great place to get actors because all you have to do is put an ad in Craigslist or anywhere, and people are just so dying for work. It's such a difficult and brutal profession, you know. It's so competitive, and wow. And we just had auditions for 2 days, and I learned the etiquette of the audition room, which is, you know, you have to learn how to say thank you and all that, and oh my God. And it was a real, and a very interesting group of people working together, and again, I did this on my own. You know, I wasn't commissioned for anyone, any of these works, you know. So it was a real interesting learning procedure. I learned there are moments when I look at these and I think, oh no, you know, that I know why we edited a certain way because that person was not as good as, you know, all that stuff that happens. But it's an incredibly complex experience doing that sort of work, and I admire, you know, people doing features, and you know.
Because I suppose you've changed from having, you know, these images which don't talk back, which you can collage and work with, to
Right.
real human beings that you're then having to guide them in delivering your lines.
Yeah, interesting in this one, in this work, because it was so important for them to get those lines right, because in most of the scenes, they were around tables. We shot them in real time with 4 simultaneous cameras pointed at each actor. So if one actor made a mistake, we had to start all over again. Because I wanted it to be like they were talking to each other. Very complicated in many ways. I had a great DP, who's one of the actors, Sam Kate. But wow.
Yeah. And interesting that the table is, of course, this site for discourse and...
I asked for a table here. We had a smaller one, I thought, because we were sitting at the table before and we were just talking, shooting the breeze like we've done for a few decades. And, oh, we should just continue that by having, you know...
Yeah, yeah. But it's the site of all our rituals. It's the site of eating and negotiation and celebration and dissection and so forth. So that's a very interesting trope that unites all of the players in the different phases. And you've also chosen different kind of scenarios, a family, guys together of a certain age. How did you choose those scenes?
I wanted to deal with different notions of family and deal with, I live in Los Angeles, and I wanted it to be a reflection of that space, which is a global city with so many different classes and genders and colors, and I thought that was important to engage because that's what my everyday life is.
But you've also got different professions. You've got what appear to be art students. You've got probably successful, financially successful
guys. There are a few studio guys there, and 2 or 3 families, some young girls in school, at a high school cafeteria. We actually shot at that cafeteria, which is used for almost every, it's in South Pasadena, for almost every film you see that's shot in a school in LA. That's the school they use. Yeah, there were a few.
So it was a kind of picture of social interaction, but through different ages, different economic groups, and so forth. So would you see it as a kind of drama or as an anthropology, or what does it mean?
Well, of course, it also is episodic, which is just the way I see things. And the narrative arc, which has become the convention of so much Hollywood film, it engages me, but not that much. I don't think that I could do a work based on a totally narrative arc. And in fact, the narrative arc in Hollywood, the only way it's successful now in many ways in terms of revenue streams is to have it be the Transformers or some, you know, machine film. I mean, I think films are in crisis. The studios are in crisis on that level. But I had to do it episodically. It allowed me to engage issues of family, of the domestic, of the professional, of the commercial in terms of consumerism. Yeah, I like that. And because it was only a 2-day shoot,
Wow.
but I mean, I couldn't afford, you know, really, it's expensive, you know.
You're a teacher and have taught for many years and influenced, I would say, generations of artists. And you've worked as a curator. And I thought very significantly you curated a show of photography at MoMA, which I think really had a huge impact on how we understand collections and what can be done with them. Could you tell us about the title of that show and how you approached it?
Well, thank you for mentioning that, Iwona, because nobody else thinks about that. Really, that show was, I am such a Martian at MoMA, I mean, forget it. It's not like I am a presence there. There was one curator there in the photo department who invited me to do this show. It was before they started doing curatorial shows, and I didn't have to do the photo department, but I engaged in it, and I called this show Picturing Greatness, but greatness is in quotes. And what I did was go through the photo collection and gather photographs of artists. And I wrote a text, which to me is an important text for me, and had the text on a 2-sided wall in the center of the room surrounded by all these photographs. And they talked about the figure of the artist as opposed to the body of the artist as stereotype, the artist as mediator between God and the public, the notion of value in art. And thank you for mentioning it, because nobody really thinks about that show, especially at MoMA. Yeah,
I think
whatever.
For curators professionally, though, actually,
great.
It was a game changer.
Thank you.
You wrote once, photography freezes moments, creates prominence, and makes history. Last year, as you know, we took more photographs in 2013 than in the entire history of photography. Do you think that's going to undermine photography's power, its sheer ubiquity?
You know, photography was the global hobby of the second half of the 20th century, and now I don't think we have to even call it photography anymore. You know, because what I think happens, this is where we're at to some degree, is that I think that people, I have a resistance to it, but it becomes increasingly impossible to experience life unless it's through a lens or on a screen. And I think that does a few things. It, again, I've used this phrase before, it promotes this collision between narcissism and voyeurism, and that it basically means that we have to think, what does it mean to have a museum, to have a gallery? What does it mean to have something on a wall? Do people look at it? Are they holding their phones up toward it? Will they ever look at those pictures again? Do the pictures or objects exist as anything else other than a background for someone to say, I've been here? You know, in many ways, pictures are now tags. The pictures, it no longer says I am here. It says I am here, but it doesn't write it anymore. People don't tag with their names. I saw this, what's up? I'm here, you know? And I think that it's not a judgment. It's really an observation of how things have changed so incredibly in the past 15 years. Really, how we get so-called information. What is this thing called information? What does it mean? What is it, our relationship to histories? What's that? You know, things have changed, you know.
In one of you've published a book of writings, and in one of them you transpose the categories of Isaiah Berlin's famous essay on thinkers from his designation, which was the hedgehog and the fox, to your designation, which is creep or arsehole. Which are you?
I'm much more of an asshole than a creep. I'm proud to say that. Because I always say, now, I am against binaries. The only place for binaries is in a digital world, which is what makes digital possible, obviously. But the whole part of it was a critique of binaries, that it's black or white, you know, good or evil. You know, gray is my favorite color with a little green thrown in, you know. So, I mean, it's not like I believe in this or that, but I think it was an interesting classifying device, and I use classification with parody, not with seriousness, you know. But I think that there used to be this thing, I had forgotten about it, but it was called horse bird muffin. And it was that you could describe people physically just by saying that. Like, you're sort of muffin bird horse. And I'm like bird muffin horse, a very little horse here. But, you know, and there was a way of sort of doing that, you know, and it's sort of funny, and yet it goes to some sort of truth of physicality. And I think that, to me, like, an asshole is somebody who would never say anything behind your back that they haven't already said to your face, you know. And creep is more an operator, a strategizer, you know, somebody working the angles, and, you know. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but it's not like I like, you know, assholes that are totally, like, abusive and always, you know, always have to act out, you know. But I think that we're all these increments, you know. Oh, yeah. Just like I don't believe in the term revolution as a singular state. To me, it's romantic. It's the increments that make up moments, that make up people, that make up historical trajectories, which are of pivotal interest to me. You know.
On that note, I'd like to throw it open to the floor. Would anyone like to make a comment or ask a question?
Let's put down Sue. Thanks. Hi. Well, I guess the thing that first struck me was, has the picture becoming so ubiquitous and becoming like a diary, now everyone's just taking pictures like instead of taking diaries, but has that like prevented us from being emotionally present because we're no longer commenting on how we felt when we were there, we're just saying we were there?
I think that's true. I mean, I can't say... we know that young children, very young children, are wired much differently now. And that the ability or the desire to establish eye contact with another human being has changed because of the sort of working the fingers and doing the screens. And that changes a social relation. There's no doubt about that. You know, and there's no doubt about the fact that being here now, which is not something that I want to celebrate as an unproblematic situation, has been incredibly interfered with by the fact that I am here now, look at this. I am writing this to you, telling you that I am here now. You know, things are changing, yeah.
Can I ask another one? Or should my second one was, can art be revolutionary, and should it be?
Well, that's the thing about revolution. You know, I mean, I think that the word has been used, because words are so important to me, that the word has its own valorization, its self-heroicism. It's in its own movie of triumphalism and being on the right side of the angels, you know. And I think that, in fact, social changes come through increments and fits and starts. And whenever I hear the term revolution or, you know, the feminist revolution, as if feminisms themselves weren't engaged in a deconstruction of the singularity, or in fact masculinist, of that triumphalism, you know? I always have problems with that. To me, the change is incremental. It gets better and then it gets worse. Do I wish for a time when there is more so-called social justice? When there's more emancipatory allowance? Yes. One person's revolution is another person's hell, you know? That's a little binary, but, you know.
Hello, thank you. It's great to hear you both speak. We spoke about images and we heard you speak about language, but can you say a little bit about the image or the visual quality of language and how your use of certain typefaces has adhered or shifted over the years of work? And then, as sort of parallel question is, Iwona described the audience as a we, and Barbara, you described it as a reader, viewer, looker. And I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit about how you anticipate someone comes to experience the work, whether it's read first or seen first or something else?
Well, I think everything is, if we are seeing subjects, everything is retinally perceived first. You enter a room, you look at a person, you know, sometimes you're looking at them and their name is given to you in the first second and the name is lost because you're engaged with this facial moment, you know, sometimes, you know. But so, yes, you walk in a room and you see green or black. I'm not a scientist, you know, but yes, you see the height of the room. And then you start, everyone navigates differently. You start looking at the words and engage their readability or not, you know. So there is no recipe. I think it changes from person to person, for sure.
But you have used sans serif
Yes.
throughout.
Yeah, I have pretty much Century School book and picture readings. That was a serif face that I used. It was a very clean serif face that I used, sort of like Caslon or Bedoni or whatever. But I pretty much use Futura, bold, ital, and once I started doing more spatialized installations, Helvetica, ultra compressed, extra compressed, only because it sets better in terms of architectural space sometimes. So it's just the intricate. I'm not a topographer, nor have I ever, you know, claimed to be a great designer or type person or anything. I make no great claims for that, you know. But I just sort of try to understand how type works, you know. I have to say, one time I was at the Hirshhorn, there was a designer in the audience, and she said, "How do you feel about stretching the type like that?" And it was like I was merciless toward the type. I had evidently broken this law or something.
Hello. What role does irony play in your work?
Yeah, I think irony is important. But like everything else, it's good in bits and pieces, you know? I think that if there was no irony in the world, we would all just do ourselves in, you know? Because it's like so horrifying, you know? If we couldn't somehow distance ourselves or laugh or see some kind of clarity through all that insanity. And I think irony helps, you know? Do I like irony all the time when it's get it, get it, get it? You have to be cool enough to get it. You know, I think that that's, again, art itself, the visual arts are incredibly encoded. Some work more than others. I like all kinds of work, all kinds of work. I'm very, I don't think, oh, that's not, you know, whatever. But I do believe that certain kinds of work are more encoded than others. I know that for my work personally, I know you don't need an MFA in conceptual art to understand my work. But that doesn't make it better than other kinds of work, necessarily. But there are works where irony is more encoded than others. Irony is a particular kind of humor, you know. I prefer comedy to say humor, you know. And irony is a particular kind of, it's sort of a more, what's the word, polished version of a sort of comedic yuck, you know.
Any more questions?
Don't know how to sing now, I'm not. Hi, Barbara. Great interview, right? I suppose it's like observation, because I can remember when I went to college, your work was when I sort of really remember as somebody who didn't know much about art and that. And apart from the colours, do you know what I mean? I was just sitting there and I was thinking some of the things you came up with, cinema and all that. But I think why I think I enjoy it so much is like a Jamie Reed. You know, there's sort of like a punk element to your work. There's a realism there. And especially the collages, it comes over like anybody can do it. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to have paints or great. Have I got a question? I don't know, really. Do you ever wish you were illiterate?
Imageless? What is imageless?
Do you ever wish you were illiterate?
Illiterate? No.
Oh, right.
Only because language is the way we can save each other.
I say that because it's like, on an aesthetic level, your work is brilliant, isn't it? I was just wondering if you just wanted to get away from looking what a letter is and look at it as a drawing. I know you can do that if you use a different language, and I suppose that could be a question as well. Have you ever thought of using different languages? Or?
Language is really important to me. I've not studied language per se, but I feel two things. A, translation and how important that is. When I do things in other, where English is not the main language, my translation of my work is crucial. And then I think of the UN, and I'm thinking, what's going on there? I mean, do people know who's doing the translating? I mean, do they know what they're actually saying? This could crazy. But I think the other thing is, a book that was very important to me was Elaine Scarry, The Body and Pain. And she's written other things since that I have not been. I think she wrote on beauty. It didn't engage me so much. But I think it's really a profound book about pain, torture, the body, relating to upstairs, the finiteness of it all, say. But the way she describes pain is that when you're in pain, your body is huge and the world disappears. And with the world disappears language. Pain is beyond language. It's mute except in its feeling. And I think that language is that thing that we can only experience when we're outside of that pain in many ways. But I think it's a profound way of thinking about the body, quote, feelings, unquote, and the power of language to save us or destroy us. You know, but when that destroying is happening, when that violence is happening, language has already gone. I think it's that great Roland Barthes quote that I've used. No, it's Mary McCarthy. In language, we forget who we... In violence, we forget who we are. In violence, we forget who we are. That's a brilliant quote. And I've used that a lot in my work. And I think that is the power of language to remind us who we are on a certain level, you know.
I think we've time for one more quick question.
Hi, thanks. In several of your comments, you've been very kind of accepting of different kinds of art practices, and you've said on a couple of occasions that doesn't make it better about one type of practice over another. You've also described yourself as feeling like, you said, a Martian in the magazines or at MoMA. And I wonder if maybe, is there a tension, do you perceive, between a feeling of kind of skeptical distance or alienation and also kind of tolerance or acceptingness of various kinds of perspective?
You know, I think that we're all in this scrim, which is threaded through with capital and prominence or the lack of both, you know. And I think basically it is both a challenge and the joy of engaging the complexities of those positions, of how, for someone who had been disenfranchised from any notion of being a famous artist when I was growing up, for sure, you know, the idea that one could somehow, for a few minutes anyway, until the fickle winds blow you away or whatever, you know, that for somehow you could use the instrumentality of that position to, in my case, try to raise doubt or bring up issues. Doubt, we haven't mentioned that, it's very important to me. Doubtlessness is frightening. It's almost that moment without language, force without language. Doubtlessness is, I've done a work that said, you know, belief plus doubt equals sanity, you know. One without the other is a very problematic state. So I think it's a challenge to be resistant, but I was not at a place where I could say, oh, I want to be located outside of that, because I always felt located outside of that, you know. So how do you negotiate, you know, these positions? It's both a challenge but also a luxury, you know. And I think that because there are so many more artists now than there were, and so many more genders and colors and classes who all of a sudden might have the ability to objectify or musicalize or textualize their experience of the world, who never thought they could do that before. The challenge is, how do you support yourself doing that? because now we have this incredible sort of dichotomy between this crazy, imploding, insane market and speculation and the need to create commentary and make art. And what I always tell my students is that, that need to create commentary and make art, that spark, will always be there for you. And it doesn't exist in places that subjugate their people and want to destroy and absent that need. So you can keep on doing that, whether you become flavor of the month or a speculative quantity that then gets dumped a year later. I think people have to not personalize their situation with that anthropology. And you see it more and more that people get huge amounts of success and they actually take it personally. They actually might think it has to do with that their work is good. Who knows? It's such a fickle sort of arena, Sometimes it does have to do with good, important work, but that importance changes in time. And what seemed important at one time is, oh, forget it, over, done, tired, seen it. The place of taste and preference is a huge determinator. And markets themselves are so arbitrary and vaporous,
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you.